Welcome to this presentation of competency-based learning. This is the second chapter which is addressing.
What is the place of assessment?
I'm Serge Ravet from Adepios and Euro Portfolio. With me today is Esther Linley, who will help me with this presentation. This presentation is developed in the context of the Transit project, which goal is to help teachers develop competency-based education, especially for the acquisition of key competencies. In the previous chapter, we addressed what is competency-based learning.
What is the place of assessment?
Will be addressed in this chapter, and in the next chapter we'll see how do we assess competencies. So, what is the place of assessment in a competency-based learning program? Central. The place of assessment is absolutely central to competency-based learning.
How shall learners know what they have to achieve?
This is the very first question one should ask when developing a competency-based learning program. Learners must know exactly when they read the objectives of a learning program what they will be able to achieve at the end. And for that, we can use competency standards or learning outcomes. We have seen in the previous chapter what competency standards were or learning outcomes were. They define what are the KSA, knowledge, skills, attitudes, and values that are required. And by extracting the information from student learning outcomes of all competency standards, you will be able to tell the learners what they will have to achieve. This is the very first stage when you define a competency-based learning program.
What and how should learners collect to demonstrate achievement?
Once you have defined the learning outcomes, you need to define how you will assess. And the very first stage is to define what kind of evidence will be provided by the learners. You will tell them how to collect and present the evidence of their learning. And for that, for example, you can use a portfolio. Portfolio is a great tool to collect, organize, and present evidence in a competency-based learning program.
How shall learners know what to do to produce the required evidence?
As we are looking at competencies, we need to provide the learner with an opportunity to practice the essence of the objective of the learning program. So we need to define a range of activities, different types of activities, and we need also to define what kind of feedback will be provided in the learning program. We define two types of feedback. There is intrinsic feedback and extrinsic feedback. Intrinsic feedback comes from the activity itself. For example, if you do a chemical experiment, it explodes. This is called intrinsic feedback. Or if you are dealing with a client and the client is very unhappy, then it is really intrinsic feedback. Extrinsic feedback will come from an external source, which could be a teacher, a tutor, or a peer. So you need to define all the feedback mechanisms that are related to the performance, to the relevant practice, which is provided to help the learner to create the evidence that will be used for assessment.
So what contents should be provided to learners to support relevant practice?
As you can see, the question of contents or knowledge comes very last in the list. In learning, traditional learning programs, in the curriculum, we start by defining the content, the books that people will have to read, and the content they will have to memorize. The content is here only to support what has been defined as relevant practice in order to create the evidence required for assessment of the learning outcomes. So this could be lessons, modules, textbooks, internet search, all the knowledge available on the internet today. And this can be delivered in the different formats. Could be a lecture, could be debriefing, tutoring, mentoring. Many ways content can be delivered to support relevant practice.
So, what data needs to be collected to inform future practice?
Once we have defined all the previous steps and we have implemented the program, we need to be able to know how good the program was, how efficient the program was, how well the learners did learn something. So, and you need to inform your institution. You need maybe to inform the inspectorate or an awarding body. So for that, you will sample learner's portfolio, or also the teacher's portfolio, in order to collect the information that will help you to improve practice in the future.
How to assess learning?
To assess learning, there are two main methods. There is one method called norm reference assessment and the other called criterion reference assessment. The objective of the norm reference assessment is to define what are excellent, good, and poor learners, how good they have achieved some exercise, how good are they at some activities. With criterion reference assessment, people are defined either as not yet competent or competent. There is no in between. This sounds very harsh, but at the same time, it is much more inclusive than one could imagine. The goal of norm reference assessment is to compare learners among themselves within a cohort. The goal of criterion reference assessment is to compare learners against the standard. So it is the same standard which is used for everybody. And this is very important to understand that when you are competent at a level 1, 2, or 3, a level 1 is not less competent than a level 2. A level 1 is not part of level 2, is not 80% of level 2 and 60% of level 3. Every level is one, you need to be 100 competent at each level. So in a criterion reference assessment, the criteria are public, and 100% of the criteria must be satisfied at each level. And level 1 is not less competent than level 2. I think this is something which is very important to understand. And in order to find the criteria, the best thing to do is to go to the standards, to go to learning outcomes or to go to competency standards. And here is an example of application of Lumber at level 3, and you will find example of criteria like select appropriate methods of presentation and justify your choice. Means you can go through the standards yourself, but here you will find the criteria that you will use for criterion-based assessment.
What is evidence-based assessment?
Evidence-based assessment, in a sense, refers to the stage 5, which is what kind of data do we collect about the assessment process, about the learning process, in order to inform future practice. And here is one definition about evidence-based assessment, which is the use of research and theory to inform the selection of assessment targets, and methods, and measures used in the assessment and the assessment process itself. So it is important to define what is good assessment, what the assessment works, what is good practice in terms of assessment. Evidence-based assessment is linked to evidence-based practice. It comes from medicine and psychology. Good medicine is based on evidence, not just theory. We need to have evidence that one specific medicine, one specific psychological approach works. It is the same for assessment. We need to look at what kind of assessment works.
What is authentic assessment?
Authentic assessment is critical for competency-based learning. Authentic assessment is just the opposite of what you see on this picture, where you have these pupils at a table, probably responding to multiple choice questions. Authentic assessment is based on evidence collected through holistic projects addressing challenging goals. And it also involves multiple judgment from oneself, peers, tutors, and it is against agreed criteria. So we have something which is totally transparent. Engage conversations with multiple actors. And the role of authentic assessment is to inform future learning. And this is important. We speak a lot about assessment as being providing feedback to learners, but it is more important to feed forward, to help people to plan for future learning. To close this chapter, I would like to attract your attention to the difference between testing and assessment. We often confuse assessment and testing. You will be able to see this slide into more details, but I would like to look at a few points. Like the process of testing is often discrete. You will look at discrete skills and we'll do a test once. Well, the assessment is something which is much more continuous, holistic, which is much more involving conversations with others. And if you look at the penultimate point, it is done, most of the tests are done to the people, to the learners, while assessment is done with the learner. The learner participates in the assessment. And the technology of choice for assessment is the portfolio, while the technology of choice for testing is often multiple choice or technology-based testing. So in summary, what we have seen is a place of assessment in competency-based learning is absolutely central. It is assessment-driven. It doesn't mean that we're just looking at testing. No, assessment must be taken in the sense of learning about learning. There is not on one side we learn and after that we are being assessed. Assessment is an integral part of learning. It is learning about our own learning. So it is assessment driven. It is not content driven. So it is the assessment itself that defines the contents and the processes, not the contents that define the assessment, which is what happens in most curriculum-based approaches. So what we have seen in this chapter is what is the place of assessment in a competency-based learning program. What we'll see in the next chapter is
how do we assess competencies?
I hope you enjoyed this presentation, and now it's your turn. And if you want to have more information, you can go to the Transit website. Thank you, Esther, for this presentation.
Thank you, Serge.